the solver I'm going to cover first is the second one down here on the list, the change in slope solver here. So let's add it on here so we can see what it's doing. So this one is a little different than the others in that it has quite a few output options here. So it takes it takes one indicator input, and then it has all of these outputs that correlate to how the slope is changing. Here. So let's see. I'll work with the stochastics indicator because the stochastics indicator, it's always reversing to sloping up to sloping down quite a bit. So it I think gives a good example here. And also what I have open and ready to go is the web page, right? So this is the Shark Indicator's web page on the change in slope, right? So to get to this page, what you can do is just put the mouse on slope. Don't click on it. Just hover over support, and then go down to here to learn Bloodhound, and then click on learn Bloodhound, and that'll bring up a different page than what you see here. But the important thing is it gets you to this right side menu here. So this menu on the right, what you just do is scroll down, and you can see a list of solvers here, and then just click on the indicator change in slope solver, and that'll take you to this documentation page. So the change in slope solver is designed to tell you kind of when the indicator is potentially starting to change directions, and if the indicator is continuing to slope up in a steeper and steeper fashion, or if the indicator is beginning to flatten out. So if we scroll down, scroll way down, you'll note that each of the outputs here, right, are numbered. So you can see the output here, right, we have number 1, number 2, number 3, and the descriptions here also denote number 1, number 2, and number 3, and so forth. And they're numbered, well, actually I should say the graphics image here is the numbers correlate to the output number as well. So the green number 1 correlates to the long output, right? So the long output is going to be the green output in Bloodhound, and the red output correlates to the short side output in Bloodhound. So the output here, number 1, strong in direction, right? What that's going to do is, you can see, so this graphic here just kind of has a very generic, curve pattern to it to illustrate, where you are in the slope, as the slope is changing of an indicator. So as the slope is changing of an indicator, to give another example, right? When you look at the stochastic, the slope is, it's always changing. Like right here is a good illustration. You can see the slope, from this point is continuing to steepen and steepen and steepen and steepen and get, and go steeper. Also, moving averages can do that. You can see here, like if we, how about if I get rid of the white one here, and we'll just look at the EMA 20. So we can see the EMA 20, is beginning to curve up, and we can see that the slope, begins to steepen and steepen and steepen. So that's what the increasing section here is denoting. So if your indicator is increasing in its rate of rise, and you have output number 1 set to 1, then let's close that. Then the long side the long output, you're going to get a long output, right? Because it's set up this way because your indicator is rising. It's rising up, and typically when indicators are rising up, typically that indicates along that price is moving up. So that's indicative of a long kind of situation. Your indicator is telling you that you probably should be in a long position. So when your indicator is rising, you're going to get a long output here. Now, for the short, you can see that the red number 1 here, you'll get a short output when your indicator has rolled over and is starting to fall. And so when its rate of fall is increasing, you're going to get an output on the short side. So that's why the red number 1 is over here. So let's take a look. So I'm going to set these outputs to 0 so we can just isolate it to the output strong in direction. So the output number 1. So let me change my indicator to the stochastics. Alright, so we're just going to use the 7, 14, and 3. That's what's on the chart. And we're looking at D. So the D is what we're seeing, the green line on the chart. Alright, so let me stretch this out here. Yeah, so there we go. Then we're kind of looked out and found a good illustration spot here. Alright, so we can see our stochastic has rolled over and it's now beginning to slope up, right? And we can see the slope is increasing and increasing and increasing, right? So it's rising faster and faster. And then we can see, sometimes it really helps to stretch your panel out, but we can see here where there's no output that we can kind of begin to see that the rise of the plot is beginning to flatten out and then roll over, right? So it's not rising as fast and it's rolling over. So that's why there's no output. So let's take a look at that graphic again. And here, let me try and make my web browser here a little smaller, like so. There we go. So where my arrow is now, essentially that's in this section of the curve pattern here, right? So the rate of rise is decreasing. So it's still rising, but it's decreasing in its rise as if it's going to start to roll over. It doesn't mean it's going to roll over, of course, but but we're not continuing to increase. It just so happens to be that with the stochastics, we can see the reason why is because price had a little pullback. Right, had a little pullback, and then as price continued to move up, we can see, looks like that is all the data I have on the chart. But as price began to move up, we can see that the stochastic began to rise again. So it began to curve back up versus rolling over. And if we just kind of reverse, reverse that pattern, we can see for the short side, right, when our stochastic is rolling over, we're getting an output. So what we're looking at is this section right here of the indicator beginning to roll over, but it's also falling at an increasing rate. So the fall is increasing, and that's what is being pointed out here. We can see that we got one bar here where the stochastic began to flatten out. So basically the stochastic kind of entered into this pattern here where it began to flatten out. It began to flatten out there. And then, right, the stochastic slope began to fall again, steeper and steeper, and then flattened out for a bar, and then it began to fall again in an increasing rate. Right. So we can see here, just within this area here, the stochastic was beginning to fall, then it would flatten out for a bar, and then it would begin to fall again. Right. So since if we go back to the solver here in our output, since only number 1, strong in direction, has a 1 in it, then the short output here, the red number 1, right, it correlates to how the curve of the indicator is going to look. So, if we also wanted, if we wanted to, also see a short output, in these areas here, right, where the stochastic is beginning to flatten out, like right there and right there, right? So that is essentially, that would be output number 2 and output number 3, right? So this is where the change in slope solver gets a little unique. So let's see, let's look at the long side. Let me switch over to the long side here, and let me try and find an area. Let's see, I'll actually find an area, and let me put some values in here. So I'm going to put 0.66, which is what was in there before, and 0.33. Right, so I'm putting 0.66 in 2 and 0.33 in 3. And if you look at the graphics here, right, we talked about number 1. So number 2, so output number 2, which is, right, the green number 2 there, or the red number 2 over here, depending if you're rising or if the slope is falling. Now, number 2 only refers to like the first bar. It only refers to the first bar as the slope begins to decrease, as the slope begins to flatten out. As it begins to flatten out. Number 2 refers to only the first bar of that flattening period. Right? So if we look at the short side, as the plot begins to flatten out here, it only refers to the first bar of that flattening out process. And then any bars after that is going to be, output number 3 relates to any bars after the first bar. Right? So obviously the second, third, fourth, however many bars, that's what number 3 is. That's what number 3 refers to. Any bars afterwards. So, all right, with that, let's take a look at what we have now. Okay. Yeah, let me stretch this way out. All right, so we'll take a look at the long side here as the stochastic is turning up. Right, so as the stochastic is turning up, it's increasing in its rate of rise, and so the output is 1. So that is out here. That's output number 1, and I set the output value to 1. So that tells us that the stochastic is, strongly rising right here, and then we get to this bar here, and let's scroll this over. So if you look at the price flag, it's at 0.66. Right, so number 2, I had it set to 0.66. Right, and it's at 0.66 because the slope is beginning to flatten out. So, right there, we're at the first bar where the stochastic is beginning to flatten out or roll over. And if I step forward on the chart to the next bar, right, so now we had a second bar where the stochastic is beginning to flatten out. And let's see if there we go. That helps illustrate it a little better. So, right, so we had two bars where the stochastic is beginning to flatten out. So on the second bar here, we can see the output, Bloodhound's output is 0.33. And that's because we're in section 3 here now. Right, so we're in section 3 where we're in this area where the rate of rise is decreasing or flattening, beginning to flatten out, potentially flatten out. So area 3 is the second bar on, second bar forward, So number 3 doesn't have, any set number of bars. Only number 2 does. So number 2 just refers to the first bar that's flattening out. Number 3 refers to any bars afterwards. And, excuse me. So the output number 3, right, I set that to a third right there. And so that's why Bloodhound's output is a third right there. And if we step forward again on the chart, so we had a third bar, that's where the stochastic, we can kind of see that the stochastic is still kind of rolling over, it's flattening out, but this is the third bar in this flattening area. And so that's why we have a 0.33. So, so once again, output number 3 is any bars after the first bar where the slope begins to flatten out. And let's step forward again. Yep, so there's a fourth bar where the stochastic is flattening out. And a fifth bar right there. So we can, if we look at the stochastic's value here, it's 0.688. And if I step forward, it's 0.69. So this just barely has an upslope to it. So therefore it's still in section 3. All right, it's still in section 3 because the stochastic is it's still rising, just barely, but it's still rising, but it's also kind of flattening out. And then finally our stochastic rolls over, and so now we're into this new section of the curve chart here. So now we're in a falling area where the indicator is falling. So we're, so that would be for the short side, that's going to be output number 1. Now for the long side, it's going to be output number 6. So that would be, for the long output, it would be this section right here. But I have this set to 0, so there's not going to be any long output here. So if I set this to 0.5, right, we can see now, if you look at the chart, we can see that long output has a 0.5 because we're in this area, section 6, right? So for the long side, we're in this output number 6 area, but for the short side, we're in output number 1. So you can kind of custom tailor this, to help you out here. I guess one kind of common way to use this is you can custom tailor this to begin to give your Bloodhound logic like a little bit of warning. So let's see. Let me focus on the long side again here. So let's take a look at these two bars here, these two bars right here. All right, so we can see that the stochastic is sloping down, so we have a short output, and it begins to diminish as the slope begins to flatten out. Now, what we can also do is if we look at this. That's actually, I'm sorry, it's we're in this section of the curve chart here, right? So it's red number 2 and red number 3. Now, red number 3 correlates, so the long side would be number 4. So as the stochastic is beginning to flatten out, if we wanted to get kind of a warning for the long side that this is flattening out and that we might get a reversal up, for the long side, we could use output number 4 here, right? So the green number 4, we could use that right here. So let me put, I'll put 0.5 in there just to illustrate. And so look here. So now on the long side, we have a 50% output on the long side, or 0.5, right? 0.5. And so that kind of gives us a little warning here, or an indication to the long side that the stochastic is starting to roll up. So kind of the use of this, I'd say, is definitely a little more of an advanced feature, that you can use in your logic. So this really kind of gets into the advanced capabilities of Bloodhound's fuzzy logic, that you can use. And so as we look at these two bars, right, as the stochastic begins to flatten out, we get a 0.5 on the output, and then eventually the stochastic does roll up, and we get a 1 on the output here. So, and so essentially that's really what the core of the solver does, is it allows you to get an indication of where your indicator is in this curve chart here, right, in this or cycle chart. And of course, you just set the outputs for whatever part of this cycle of the indicator that you want, that applies to your system. So some of you may have kind of trade rules where you are looking at something at the stochastics, or something like the stochastics. Maybe you're looking at the momentum indicator, or maybe you're even looking at moving averages, and you're interested when your indicator is potentially starting to roll over, and that's where the change in slope solver would be helpful to you, is knowing when or getting some kind of a heads up, an indication of when your indicator is beginning to roll over to the opposite direction. So if I just wanted if I wanted to use this change in slope solver just to warn me when the stochastic is beginning to roll over, right, I could just use the number 4 here. So let's see here. Okay, yeah, so on the long side, number 4 is in the decreasing but flattening out. And for a short output, it's when our indicator is rising but beginning to flatten out just before it rolls over and turns down. So as we look at the chart here, right, so the way I have this set up now, our stochastic is still pointing up, but it's right at that point, where it could roll over any moment. And you can see I'm getting a short output here, giving me a kind of an indication, or a warning, or a pre-setup or something like that prior to the stochastic actually rolling over. So, and of course, the same for the long side here, as our stochastic begins to flatten out, and just before it rolls up, it reverses direction and rolls up, we're getting a long output here. So if I put a 1 back in here in section number 1, then if we look at the output here, so remember number 4 I set to 0.8, and number 1 I set to 1 of an output. And if you look at the, let's stretch this up here a little bit. So if you look at the outputs on the long side here, you can see that the first 2 only correlate to 0.8, right? So that's just kind of giving me a little warning. And then as the stochastic actually is sloping up, then I get a full value of 1 or 100%. So, and of course, same for the short side. So, let's reverse that. There we go. So on the short side here, right, so our stochastic is sloping up, but it's starting to flatten out. And on the short side, we have a 0.8 on the short side output. Step forward, same thing. Stochastic is sloping up, but it's really beginning to flatten out. Same thing, a 0.8 on the output for the short side. And then eventually the stochastic rolls over. And now the short side output is a value of 1. So that's kind of, that's another example of the fuzzy logic use for this.